The most beautiful thing we can experience is the mysterious. It is the source of all true art and science. We tend to treat curiosity as a personality trait, a gift, something certain people simply have. But psychology describes something more precise, more uncomfortable, and far more interesting. In 1994, psychologist George Loewenstein published a paper that reorganized the field. The thesis was precise. Curiosity is not a general appetite for knowledge. It is a specific response to perceived incompleteness. The mind detects a gap between what it knows and what it suspects is knowable, and that gap produces tension, not pleasant tension, uncomfortable tension. In Loewenstein's model, curiosity is closer to an itch than a pleasure. The reward is not in the asking. The reward is in the closing. What this means, the minds that changed reality were not minds comfortable with mystery. They were minds disturbed by it, and the disturbance drove the work. There is a dominant narrative about the great thinkers of history, that they were secure, confident, visionary figures, that they saw what others couldn't because they were somehow superior. That narrative is almost always false. Galileo Galilei pointed a telescope at the moon in 1609 and saw mountains. The Aristotelian framework that organized European thought for 2,000 years held that celestial bodies were perfect spheres, smooth, unchanging. What Galileo saw contradicted that directly. He was not certain. He published anyway. Psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, in a study of creative thinkers at the University of Chicago in the 1990s, identified a consistent pattern. What distinguished transformative thinkers was not processing speed or superior memory. It was a higher tolerance for contradiction, the capacity to hold incompatible observations in mind without resolving the tension prematurely. In 2009, neuroscientists Matthias Gruber and Charan Ranganathan at the University of California, Davis, conducted a neuroimaging study on epistemic curiosity. Participants were shown trivia questions. For each question, they rated their level of curiosity. Then they received the answer, and during the waiting interval, saw a neutral face. The result was unexpected. When curiosity was high, memory for the answer improved. But memory for the neutral face also improved, completely unrelated to the question. Curiosity doesn't only open the channel for that specific piece of information, it opens the entire system. The mechanism identified was dopaminergic. The anticipation of closing a gap activates the reward circuit, the same circuit involved in motivation, movement, and learning. The curious mind is not receiving a reward, it is anticipating one. And that anticipation temporarily reorganizes how it processes everything else. In 1962, historian and philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn published The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. The central argument was not about scientific facts. It was about the psychology of scientific communities. Science does not progress by continuous accumulation. It progresses by rupture. Periods of normal science, researchers working within an agreed framework, are interrupted by anomalies, observations the system cannot absorb, and when anomalies reach a critical threshold, the framework breaks. Kuhn observed that the people who initiate paradigm shifts are almost never senior figures in the field. They are younger researchers, or researchers from adjacent disciplines, who have not yet fully internalized the existing framework. They notice the anomaly because they were not trained to dismiss it. Psychologist Charlene Namath at the University of California, Berkeley, studied what she called minority influence, how a single dissenting voice alters the cognitive processing of the majority. Her research, developed across the 1980s and 1990s, found that exposure to minority dissent does not simply introduce a new opinion. It triggers divergent thinking in all members of the group. There is a pattern that repeats with unsettling regularity across the history of transformative thought. The person who asks the question that disrupts the existing framework rarely benefits from the disruption in their own lifetime. The cost is typically immediate. The recognition is typically posthumous. Ignaz Semmelweis was a Hungarian physician working in Vienna in the 1840s. He noticed that mortality rates in maternity wards were dramatically higher in units where medical students came directly from performing autopsies. His hypothesis: doctors were carrying something on their hands from the bodies of the dead to the bodies of the living. He introduced hand washing with chlorinated lime solution. Mortality dropped from roughly 10% to under 2%. The medical establishment rejected him, not because the data was weak. The data was precise. They rejected him because his hypothesis implied that physicians were causing the deaths they were supposed to prevent. The gap he opened was not merely empirical. It was institutional. Psychologist Carol Dweck, in her research on implicit theories of intelligence at Columbia University in the 1990s, identified what she called a fixed mindset, the belief that capacity is static, not developmental. Institutions, Dweck's work implies, can have fixed mindsets as readily as individuals. What connects Galileo, Socrates, Semmelweis, and the others scattered across centuries of the same pattern? Not intelligence in the conventional sense, not credentials or institutional position or access to better information, a particular relationship with incompleteness. These were minds that could not look away from a gap, that experienced the unresolved question not as an abstraction, but as a pressure, something that demanded attention, interrupted other processes, and would not allow the comfortable conclusion to stand unchallenged. Loewenstein's information gap theory describes this as a feature of all human cognition, present in varying degrees. The gap produces discomfort. The discomfort drives inquiry. What distinguished these minds was the intensity of the discomfort and the willingness to follow it into territory that offered no guarantee of return. The gap is still there. The question is who can stay long enough to see what it opens. Inner observer. Observe your mind. Understand reality.